have several situations unfolding near the Gaza border.
Our world is in upheaval. October 7th is a day that will forever live in infamy.
The failures of October the 7th are the failures of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Israel's darkest days since the Holocaust happened under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's watch.
In those first hours and days, he was in complete shock. Everything he believed about Hamas turned out to be wrong.
He was Mr. Security. I guess the 7th of October changed things fundamentally.
His response to the Hamas terror attacks was immediate and devastating.
Never again must never be an empty promise. Never again is now.
He portrays himself very much as somebody who is being persecuted, but that he always arises triumphant.
Israelis have always been divided on their support for Netanyahu. But in the last year, he split the country like never before. This is the story of Israel's longest-serving leader.
I think he's convinced that only he can save Israel.
He's a great leader. I think he's a leader of historic proportions. I think he's the greatest statesman we've had.
How a life in power has defined his actions over the last 12 months.
He's not a diplomat. He's a populist politician.
I think that we cannot rule out anything that might help him ensure his own personal political survival.
Can such a controversial figure balance peace and security in one of the most volatile regions on Earth? Benjamin Netanyahu is born in Israel in 1949. A new country fighting for its place in the world.
I knew his father very well, Benzion Netanyahu. And he grew up in an extremely intellectual and very Zionist, very dedicated Zionist household.
Zionism is the movement for a Jewish homeland in the state of Israel.
His father was very active in the political world, not necessarily as a politician, but had very strong opinions on Israel's security.
Benjamin's father, Benzion, is a university lecturer and a historian who helps guide the Zionist movement in a more right-wing direction. He impresses on his sons the idea of Israel having a sovereign state and a strong military.
He was born with natural intelligence, charisma, and ambition. And in a sense, he was in the right place at the right time.
In 1948, a year before Netanyahu is born, Israel comes into being, a small but powerful nation in the heart of the Middle East. In the aftermath of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, there was an urgency for a Jewish homeland.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Following a contentious vote by the United Nations to partition Palestine, the State of Israel is born.
Israel had taken its place among the nations of the world.
But it's a nation menaced on almost every side by Arab hostility. And as its people get down to the tough task of tilling a barren soil, they must go armed.
There is a sense of optimism in the new country, but it comes at a cost. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are forced out of their homes.
It was during the time of the establishment of Israel, whereby 2/3 of the Palestinian people were physically forced out of their homes, of their farms, of their businesses, of their properties. My own parents and my own grandparents included.
The moment that Israel declares independence, the neighbors come in and start a war, right? And they just don't accept the terms of Israel's existence. Israel is in a very tough neighborhood, and if you look on a map, you'll see that it's surrounded by folks that, if we look right now, don't seem like very good friends to them.
Benjamin, known by family and friends as Bibi, grows up in a country whose existence from the start is contested. But he doesn't spend all his childhood in Israel. His father moves the family to the United States, a cultural shift which shapes Netanyahu.
Netanyahu's childhood would have been different from many of the other Israelis of his generation, primarily because part of his youth was spent in the United States, which means he learned English very well. It also means he was exposed in a very organic way to American life, eventually American political life, and American Jewish life.
At 18, Netanyahu leaves high school and returns to Israel to join the military, along with his brother Yoni. It's instilled in him that a strong army is needed to protect your homeland.
What's fascinating about Benjamin Netanyahu in a way is he had, by any normal standards, a pretty stellar military career. He was in one of the elite combat units, Sayeret Matkal. He was one of the people involved in kind of special forces work, at one point took a bullet.
The culture of his unit, Sayeret Matkal, which means only the daring will succeed. Nothing can stand in the way to get your goals. In that respect, I think that he is tenacious, he is setting a goal, and like a laser beam, he's concentrating on the goal.
He's incredibly focused. He's goal-driven, and in our world where every other person you meet has ADHD, it's pretty amazing to see a guy who can just focus on the task at hand.
In 1972, Netanyahu goes back to the States to study architecture and management. He gets married and finds a job, but it isn't long before something brings him back to Israel.
The turning point in his life came in 1976 with the heroic episode in Israeli mythology, the Entebbe rescue.
Here's the situation in what's turning out to be the year's most spectacular hijack story.
On June the 27th, 1976, a plane is hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. 248 passengers are held hostage in Entebbe, Uganda.
Relatives of the Israeli hostages held an emotional meeting with government representatives this morning. They didn't care that Israel has a basic policy of not dealing with terrorists.
The Palestinian hijackers, with some non-Arab accomplices, now say they will execute the hostages on Sunday, unless their demands are met.
After a week, Israel launches a surprise rescue operation involving Israeli special forces, the Sayeret Matkal.
The main problem was to get to the terrorists with the biggest surprise possible.
The group uses a decoy car to get into the terminal and take out the hijackers in an assault that lasts 30 minutes. The rescue mission is led by Benjamin Netanyahu's older brother and is celebrated as a success.
His brother, Yoni, was simultaneously hailed as the hero, the commanding officer, one of the commanders, and also the sole military casualty.
The entire family was shattered by it. Netanyahu, of course, was shattered by it. He heard the news. He was the one who had to drive to his parents in Ithaca and break the news to them. There's no question that it would have a terrible impact on the family.
To give up your life in the interests of your country is the supreme act of patriotism, and he would have been intensely proud of his brother, but also felt that there is a legacy that has to be continued, albeit in a different way.
He took what happened with his brother, what his brother sacrificed, and he was able to provide the intellectual foundations for the United States and for many Western democracies in building an approach to fighting terrorism.
Benjamin Netanyahu devoted himself to memorializing Yoni and established the Yonatan Institute and published his letters and made sure that Israeli society would valorize Yoni Netanyahu. Did he do it purposely and strategically? I have no idea, but he certainly was able to benefit from being associated with the great image of Yoni.
Yoni Netanyahu, who was the leader of that raid. And we have with him his brother, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm so glad that he's listen.
And he finishes the description in his book. I do not know how many men there are like Yoni in Israel, but I'm sure we have enough to ensure that Israel meets the grim tests that face her in the future.
He regularly appears on television, honing his message, building the connection between Israel and the USA.
Nobody wants peace more than Israel. But the stumbling block to the road for peace is this demand for a PLO state, which will mean more war, which will mean more violence in the Middle East.
It's certainly one of Netanyahu's main assets, that he can do what, in a sense, no other Israeli politician can do. He can go and speak, in particular, to American audiences in flawless American English.
The media loved him in the beginning. Well, he's a master of the media. The camera also likes him. He would not have any interviews where they showed his right side. He said his left side was better.
His American English and his ability to really traverse both worlds, to have a leg in Israel and a leg firmly in the United States as well, made him very unique in being able to communicate the Israeli story to Americans and make it meaningful to them.
It's from this platform that Netanyahu eventually becomes ambassador to the United Nations.
He was a great ambassador. He used his intelligence, he used his rhetorical capabilities. Also, I think he used his charm. He had very many good personal relations with foreign ambassadors, with the American ambassador. But he was always a tough nut.
At what stage he became a political animal, it's a little bit hard to tell, but he clearly followed things closely and understood that the focus on kind of stealing the show, making himself the center of attention, was new in Israeli life. He also took American political consultants and speech coaches.
By the early 90s, Netanyahu is elected to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. It's 1993, and an historic ceremony is happening in Washington, D.C. President Clinton is hoping to create peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians in an arrangement known as the Oslo Accords.
It was the first major breakthrough between Israelis and Palestinians since 1948.
After nearly 30 years of fear, hatred and bloody conflict, Israel and the PLO took a decisive step on the road to peace. The eyes of the 3,000 VIP guests were set firmly on the PLO chairman and Israel's premier. Arafat and Rabin, once the bitterest of enemies, now perhaps just a little uneasy at their first meeting.
At one level, it was a huge step in the right direction, because as part of the accord, Arafat and the Palestinians renounced terrorism as a mode of political activity, and ultimately said they could accept the permanent existence of the State of Israel.
Then came the signing of an agreement that gives self-government to the 1.8 million Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Throughout the ceremony, the leaders had stayed backstage. Would they shake hands? Eventually they did, uneasily.
By now, Netanyahu is a big player in Israeli politics. He's also skeptical about the Accords.
I think the whole conception that we would entrust our security and the battle against terrorism to Yasser Arafat and the PLO was preposterous from the start.
Netanyahu, like the majority of Israelis, opposed the Oslo Accords. Until 1993, Israel's stated position was that you don't negotiate with terrorists. You don't make deals with terrorists. You can't.
Netanyahu's political brand was created in no small part through his opposition to the Oslo agreements.
His Excellency Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, Chairman Arafat.
He didn't want them. He doesn't believe in Palestinian self-determination. He barely says the word Palestinian. He says it, but he doesn't like it. And he has committed himself for decades to doing everything he can to avoid there ever being a Palestinian state.
The people of Israel want a real peace, and real peace means peace with security, peace they can trust, with a partner they can trust, and they don't feel they have it here. We want a real peace, not a fake one.
Prime Minister Rabin and Netanyahu now stand firmly apart on the issue. They organize opposing rallies. In October 1995, Netanyahu speaks at one of the biggest anti-Oslo events.
At the time, there were accusations that Netanyahu led mobs that incited crowds against Rabin. Rabin was depicted on posters that Netanyahu looked out on, saw in the crowds he was addressing, depicting Rabin as Yasser Arafat, a Palestinian leader, or even in the uniform of a Nazi, in the SS uniform.
On the other side are the Israelis in favor of Oslo. They rally under the banner of yes to peace, no to violence. An estimated 100,000 Israelis turn out at one event. Those in attendance hold hands and sing songs together. To the world, it looks like a beautiful moment of solidarity. But as the rally is drawing to a close and Rabin is descending from the stage, there is unease in the air.
At 11:10, the Prime Minister of Israel and the Minister of Defense, Mr. Yitzhak Rabin, passed away. He was hit by 3 bullets in his chest and his abdomen.
I always refer to it as perhaps the most successful assassination in history, because the objective was to prevent there ever being a peace process. And look, 30 years on, there's never been any progress. It achieved its goal.
Rabin is shot by a right-wing extremist opposed to his peace policies. His death sends shockwaves around the world.
That was a bullet not just in the heart of an Israeli prime minister, it was a bullet in the heart of the whole peace process. It was a bullet directed to completely kill any hope for a two-state solution outcome.
The American people mourn with you in the loss of your leader, and I mourn with you, for he was my partner and friend.
The extent of Netanyahu's responsibility for the situation has been debated for 3 decades.
Netanyahu was the opposition candidate who was very critical of Rabin, who certainly contributed to an atmosphere of hostility to Rabin. I think it's a very, very nuanced question about the degree of his responsibility for that.
Netanyahu over and over and over again spoke out against the rhetoric that was referring to Yitzhak Rabin as a traitor. He rejected it out of hand. He defended him. He did not engage in incitement. He engaged in responsible discourse on a very controversial and ultimately very emotional issue in Israel.
After the assassination, the country is bereft. Rabin's deputy, Shimon Peres, takes charge. However, it's not long before the country goes to the polls to choose a new leader. And Netanyahu runs for office for the first time.
It doesn't look like the face of victory. Mr. Peres knows that today's vote could go either way. Right up to the end, he's repeating the Labour Party campaign mantra.
I think the peace process will come to an end, and I think the intifada will be increased.
His concept of negotiations is collective bargaining. We bargain, they collect. I have a different concept. And that is that it's give and take, not take and take. There'll be mutual concessions, and they'll have to abide by it.
There were a series of suicide bombings that Hamas was undertaking against Israeli civilians. He certainly was in the thick of it, blaming Oslo, blaming Israel's decisions, and leading the population to really view the Oslo process as having pulled the trigger on those suicide bombs. And he capitalized on it, no question, in order to rally his supporters and get elected.
Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu elected with a wafer-thin margin of just 30,000 votes, less than 1% of the turnout.
Finally, Netanyahu is leading the Israeli people, but the peace process isn't at the top of his to-do list.
The Foreign Secretary, Malcolm Rifkind, expressed Britain's grave concern at the faltering peace process before meeting the Israeli Prime Minister in Jerusalem today.
He was Prime Minister. He continued the accords, despite having been so against them. He slowed them down, he signed them incrementally, grudgingly, which led to the collapse of the entire peace process.
The public decide the blame for the lack of progress lies with Netanyahu and vote him out at the next election. In the years that follow, the repeated failure of the peace talks contributes to a surge in violence from frustrated Palestinians.
I think when you're desperate and there's no other means, and you have no other channel to which you can actually voice all of the pain and trauma and difficulty and to say something about your conditions, then you turn to violence.
Carnage in the heart of Jerusalem after bus number 19 was blown apart by a suicide bomber at the height of the rush hour. The blast took place just round the corner from the official residence of Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
During the period, Israelis live in constant fear of suicide bombings on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. They look once again to Benjamin Netanyahu to defend their embattled state.
Absolutely nothing can be achieved by attempts of violence or threats of violence or the use of violence. In fact, the opposite will happen. If violence is attempted, Israel will respond, and it will set us all back, it will set peace back.
Some of the attacks in Israel are carried out by Hamas, a militant group with a political wing. The population of Gaza support Hamas because of their unwavering dedication to the Palestinian cause. They soon become the governing force of the Gaza Strip.
The Israeli government's initial reaction was to be delighted, because although Hamas were an extreme Islamist organization, one of the principles of normal political process is if you can divide your enemy is weaker and you are stronger. And here the Palestinians were deeply divided.
If you think about what makes Netanyahu a powerful political figure, it is the fact that he is seen as the military guy. If there is an enemy on his territory that he can keep under control, there is a reason for Israelis to keep re-electing him and for him to keep existing as a political figure and the embodiment of the fight.
Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by Israel and many countries around the world. As long as they are in control of Gaza, Netanyahu can argue for a strong security presence.
This is an organization committed to our destruction. You can only make peace with an enemy that wants peace. An enemy that continues to seek your destruction is not a partner for peace. We're looking for a peace partner.
Netanyahu was reported saying to fellow politicians, if you don't want to see a Palestinian state, then it's in our interest to bulk up, beef up, strengthen Hamas.
The violence and division in occupied Palestine and Israel continues. By 2009, the country is ready to elect Netanyahu as prime minister once again. It's 2009, and Benjamin Netanyahu is set to begin his longest run at the top of Israeli politics. He leads a coalition in Israel's parliament, the Knesset.
In election after election, the amount of votes that Netanyahu's party receives as a percentage of the entire electorate never really exceeds more than 20–25% of the electorate. He's very skilled at building coalitions.
One of the problems that all Israeli prime ministers have is their ghastly electoral system of proportional representation. And that meant even tiny parties had to be represented in the parliament, and it meant that every government had to be a coalition.
Netanyahu, I think, understands that right now he cannot change the system, so he masters the system. How do you master the system? Give more than your opposition to the parties in the middle. So he would give more budgets to the religious parties. He would give everything that the right-wing parties want, something that sometimes is even on the expense of Israeli national interests.
Netanyahu goes on to win 5 more elections by organizing coalitions in this way.
Netanyahu will move back into the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem for a 6th time. He only left it 16 months ago.
In fact, he's held power almost uninterrupted for the last 20 years or so. A generation has grown up here thinking that the words Prime Minister and Benjamin Netanyahu are basically, synonymous.
You might not necessarily agree with his politics, but I think that people can appreciate that he gets what he wants out of a situation, and he is obviously very good at forming political coalitions. Not everybody would see this favorably, but he's willing to do what it takes in order to stay in power.
The noise among his supporters out here is reverberating inside that courtroom. They are just as defiant out here as he is in there.
The longer Netanyahu is in power, the more problems he has to deal with. Corruption charges filed in 2019 loom over him.
He's on trial in 3 separate cases. One has a bribery charge attached to it. That's the most serious, and all 3 of them have fraud and breach of trust elements. It's been going for a long, long time.
I'm not trying to minimize it, but I'm saying that the corruption thing is not something that he was selling Israeli secrets to Iran or being a traitor to his country. It's not that kind of territory, but it would be the end of his political career if he was convicted.
Amid these corruption charges, Netanyahu backs a plan to limit the Supreme Court's authority and hand power back to the government. This sparks massive nationwide protests.
The Israeli public woke up, they responded, and they stood up in huge numbers to protest and to say this is not something that we will accept.
If you want to change something so fundamental as the judicial system, you have to do it in a consensus. He did not do it in a consensus. That split Israel into 2. This is where millions came out in the streets to protect and defend the judicial system.
By mid-2023, Netanyahu is preoccupied with internal politics.
He was really thinking about domestic protests and the fact that you've had people marching in the street, demonstrating against him, for months and months and months, and all of Israeli society thinking that he should get the heck out of office.
Then, on October the 7th, everything changes.
Breaking news. People across southern Israel have woken up to the sound of sirens.
People were told to shelter indoors.
We have several situations unfolding near the Gaza border.
Israel's defense force says it's declared a state of war and is calling up military reservists.
The most worrying development, some Hamas fighters have managed to get over the border from Gaza into Israel, in some cases using paragliders.
We know that there are bodies, the bodies of Israeli civilians lying on the streets of towns, villages and farms in southern Israel.
The militants sent fighters across the border into Israel.
It is a very, very volatile situation.
If Israeli civilians all of a sudden are finding themselves as hostages inside Gaza Strip, this will be a catastrophe for Israel.
There is nobody who really saw this coming.
More Israeli citizens had been slaughtered at any time since the Second World War.
The biggest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust.
Hamas fighters kidnap more than 250 men, women and children from their homes, taking them hostage in the Gaza Strip.
Militarily, their border was not protected sufficiently. Ultimately, the buck stops with the man in charge. The failures of October the 7th are the failures of Benjamin Netanyahu.
I think it's important to understand that October the 7th was not only a catastrophe for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people, it was a personal disaster for Netanyahu himself. This was really the collapse of Netanyahu's strategic worldview, and many would argue also in part an outcome of his divisive domestic politics.
In those first hours and days, he was in complete shock because everything he believed about Hamas turned out to be wrong. He had a long-running understanding of the idea that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was not a threat and that he could manage it without resolving it.
Like it or not like it, and he certainly doesn't like it, October the 7th happened on his watch, and he was the person who had all the material, all the security information, all the diplomatic information, all the intelligence, and was leading the country.
For over 15 years, Netanyahu has accepted the status quo, with Hamas in control of the Gaza Strip. He now does everything in his power to take them out.
אזרחי ישראל היקרים, התחלנו, ואני מדגיש, רק התחלנו להכות בחמאס. התמונות של החורבן וההרס ממעוזי החמאס בעזה הן רק ההתחלה. חיסלנו מאות רבות של מחבלים, ולא נעצור שם. אמרתי שכל מקום שממנו פועל החמאס יהפוך לאיי חורבות. זה כבר קורה היום, וזה יקרה ביתר שאת בהמשך.
I think one of the things that became very clear on October 7th is that there is no political solution. There's only a military solution.
At the command of Netanyahu, the Israeli Defense Force carry out air assaults on Gaza, followed by a full-scale ground offensive.
It's a strategy. They saw it as an opportunity to literally turn Gaza lifeless. And you drop 2,000 pounds bombs on neighborhoods, unimaginable.
Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Aid is not being let through deliberately. Israel is being called out for this. Biden and his team have continuously tried to negotiate access. But I think it's hard to look at this and not feel like it is collective punishment, that all Palestinians that lived within the boundaries of Gaza are being punished for what Hamas did.
The death toll is so high because Hamas had what are in effect bomb shelters, but they used those shelters, and I'm referring to the underground tunnels, for themselves and for their own fighters and commanders, while leaving civilians, children, women, men, above ground and wholly exposed.
I am from Gaza, so I'm on the phone all the time with our people, and what I hear is simply unimaginable. You wouldn't imagine we would reach this point of a deliberate man-made situation.
This was the absolute chaos moments after the Israeli airstrikes hit the outskirts of Rafah last night.
One of the most significant military maneuvers is the assault on Rafah. Near the Egyptian border, it's targeted because it's seen as a key Hamas stronghold.
It was obvious that Israel can't win the war without taking over Rafah and the international border between Gaza and Egypt. In fact, that, to my mind, should have been the first thing that Israel did.
There are no operational hospitals in Rafah now, and so the bodies have been collected at a small clinic. 2 words written on one bag: woman, child.
The suffering is something that we're concerned with. Israel has gone to lengths that no other government and no other army in modern urban warfare has gone to prevent civilian casualties. For us, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. For Hamas, every civilian casualty is a strategy. They're trying to keep them in harm's way while we're trying to get them out of harm's way.
It's not just the use of bombardments. It's not just the use of, land invasion and the tanks and all the horrific stories of murdering people in their homes. It's about the use of disease as a weapon of war, of food and famine as a weapon of war, whereby the one conclusion is extermination, mass extinction.
Reactions to the brutality of the October 7th attacks and assault on Gaza play out across the world. Protesters in support of both Palestine and Israel taking to the streets.
Tonight, the crisis in the Middle East fueling demonstrations thousands of miles away.
Well, across the UK, demonstrations calling for a ceasefire have gotten underway.
Tens of thousands of people are flooding the streets in a powerful show of support for Israel.
Back here, protesters have taken to the streets in cities again, calling for a ceasefire in the Middle East.
For now, there is no sign of these protests dwindling in number or intensity.
Israel's war with Hamas is now on the global conscience. The International Criminal Court, based in the Netherlands, calls for the arrest of the leaders of Hamas and Netanyahu himself for alleged crimes against humanity.
Amongst those charges are the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, and other inhumane acts as crimes against humanity.
Domestically, it hasn't impacted him at all. Internationally, it really shows the hostile drift of the Western world. I mean, we're not even a member of the ICC. They have no jurisdiction over Israel.
An independent court that has a political identity that is coming out and trying to say and do something. And look, there are good grounds here for us all to say we need to at least investigate these charges.
Netanyahu has denied the aspirations of the Palestinians who live under the control of Israel. So does he deserve the most severe criticism? Yes. Is he a war criminal? It depends how you define these terms.
Critics say Netanyahu is too influenced by the extreme right-wing anti-Arab parties in his coalition government. He must appease the likes of Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who are fiercely against a ceasefire in Gaza.
Netanyahu is incredibly beholden to the right-wing politics of Israel at this very moment. And the right is seizing its moment. And if anything, taking full advantage of it and using the cover of what is going on to do even more.
The far right has their own agenda, which is quite far-reaching and sometimes I would say messianic, that could be dangerous to the region and to Israel. And we do not see Netanyahu call them into order because he's afraid that they will bring down his government.
Netanyahu's reliance on his far-right coalition partners creates problems for him at home, as well as abroad.
Netanyahu faces a lot of anger among the Israeli public, and particularly among hostage families who feel that he has not put the return of the hostages at the top of his list of priorities.
It's a desperately difficult issue, regardless of whether it's Netanyahu or even the finest, most principled person in the world. How do you combine defeating a terrorist organization without at the same time endangering your own citizens who are held as hostage by them?
In order to have demonstrations make an impression on a leader, the leader has to have a sense of accountability, responsibility, shame, and there is no legal mechanism to turn big street protests, even 500,000 people, into elections.
I think it is reasonable to conclude he does not want a deal, because that would mean the end of a war which he, for his own political reasons, believes serves him and serves his only true objective, which is staying in power.
I'm leaving this morning on a very important trip to the United States at a time when Israel is fighting on 7 fronts. Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East.
Israel for many years regarded its #1 strategic asset as not being a weapon system or being territory, but being its relationship with the United States.
The perception that Netanyahu has a privileged and special influence in the United States is a significant domestic political asset for Netanyahu.
The Prime Minister of the State of Israel.
I think a lot of people would interpret that as actually being less about trying to influence US opinion and more about trying to influence Israeli opinion, to show the Israeli public that he still has this unique ability to win over a US political support at a crucial time for the State of Israel.
We meet today at a crossroads of history. Our world is in upheaval. In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization. For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together.
Still very much at home performing to an American audience. His speech to Congress gets a rapturous reception. But outside the US Capitol, hundreds are protesting.
The one person who promised the Israelis that he has got America is the one person who will actually push the US-Israeli relationship apart.
US used to be unabashedly pro-Israeli, no nuance. Can't even talk about it. That has shifted now. That whole conversation with a new generation is changing the entire politics of how all of the US sees that relationship with Israel.
Cracks in the Israeli-US relationship are fine ones. They remain strong strategic allies who share an enemy in Iran.
Netanyahu's career began with him warning about Iran. And in fact, people sometimes to satirize him will clip together sort of montages of him saying Iran is only 9 months, 6 months, 10 months, a year from a nuclear bomb. And he's been saying that for 30 plus years.
Here's a diagram. This is a bomb. This is a fuse. In the case of Iran's nuclear plans to build a bomb, this bomb has to be filled with enough enriched uranium.
The most important thing is that we prevent this regime from having atomic bombs to carry out their designs on destroying Israel and their mad fantasy of taking over the Middle East and from there to the world.
They are bent on Israel's destruction. And he is the one who keeps saying it, and he says Israel has to be prepared for it. And I think his entire career was around stopping Iran.
Iran funds Hamas in Gaza, but it also supports the much larger Islamist militant group, Hezbollah, based in Lebanon.
Hezbollah, which is many, many times more powerful than Hamas, is encamped close to the northern border. Tens of thousands of Israelis can't go back to their homes there. And when we talk about terrorist groups, people should not think of sort of little ragtag cells. Hezbollah is one of the strongest armies in the world.
The fragile peace on Israel's northern border with Lebanon shattered after October 7th. And in August, the conflict escalates.
The Israeli preemptive strike came in the early hours. Huge explosions rupturing the morning quiet across southern Lebanon.
מה שהיה היום זה לא סוף פסוק. חיזבאללה ניסה לפנות בוקר לתקוף את מדינת ישראל ברקטות ובכטב"מים. אנחנו הנחינו את צה"ל לבצע מתקפת מנע עצימה.
In September, an audacious attack in Lebanon involving exploding pages is attributed to Israel.
Yet Hezbollah has shown no sign of submission, its leaders vowing to continue the fight.
It marks the start of another war for Netanyahu. With major wars being waged against Hezbollah and Hamas, Netanyahu's need to defend Israel is critical. The decisions he takes in the coming weeks could be the most important in defining his legacy.
The world's view of Israel is being changed in a moment from being the David in the David and Goliath story to definitely turning into the Goliath.
The country was invaded on his watch. It is attacked on multiple fronts. Iran is pulling the strings and closing in on the bomb. He's got a difficult relationship with the United States. Israel is largely unloved internationally, not all his fault, but partly a function of some of the people in his government and some of the things he says and does.
Bibi has survived so many things, he could conceivably even survive the worst breach of Israeli security and sovereignty in the history of the country since independence.
For us, he would be a symbol of the occupation, expansion, and repression and oppression. But at the very end, have really brought so much mayhem, so much chaos, so much suffering to millions of people.
He's always worked towards the goal, one goal, which is to secure Israel and the Jewish people, to secure us in the present, to secure our future.
He will be the man who took no steps towards resolving Israel's ultimate question, its relationship with its neighbors, its place in that region. That is the unfinished work of 1948, and he has not taken even a step towards it.